England and France have been locked in the long conflict known as the 100 Years' War for nearly 8 decades. The young English king, Henry V, has revived his grandfather's claim to the French throne and launched a daring invasion of France. After capturing the port town of Harfleur, Henry's weary army attempts to march to the safety of Calais, but finds itself cornered by a massive French force near the small village of Agincourt. Outnumbered 4-1, exhausted and far from home, the English face seemingly impossible odds. What follows will become one of the most remarkable military upsets in history. A battle where common archers would prevail against knights, where mud would prove more decisive than steel, and where a king's courage would transform a band of tired soldiers into legends. This is the story of ordinary men caught in the midst of extraordinary events, and how one autumn day in a muddy French field would be remembered throughout the centuries. October 25, 1415, the fields near Agincourt, France. Thomas Fletcher flexed his fingers inside his worn leather gloves, trying to ignore the persistent rain that had turned the field into a quagmire. Before him stood King Henry V in his gleaming armour adorned with the royal insignia of England, the red cross of St. George fluttering on the banner beside him. The young king's face was set with determination that belied his 30 years, his eyes scanning the mass of French knights and men-at-arms that vastly outnumbered their ragged English force. "They say the French have 30,000 men," whispered Will Cooper, Thomas's childhood friend from their village in Yorkshire. "We've not even 6,000, and most half-starved and weary from the march." Thomas nodded solemnly. The English army had marched for weeks across northern France, their numbers dwindling from illness and hunger. After the successful siege of Harfleur, Henry had pressed on toward Calais, but the French army had intercepted them here, near the small village of Agincourt. "The king refused their terms," said Thomas, watching as Henry moved among the men-at-arms and archers, his presence alone bolstering their resolve. They wanted him to renounce his claim to the French throne. Will shook his head. After coming this far? He'd rather face these odds than surrender his birthright. The English army had taken position between two woods, forcing the French to compress their superior numbers into a narrow front. Thomas and Will stood with the other archers, longbows at the ready, their stakes planted in the ground before them to ward off cavalry charges. King Henry's voice suddenly rose above the murmur of the nervous troops. He was not tall, but his presence commanded attention. His armour gleamed despite the dreary day, the royal coat of arms of England emblazoned on his surcoat. The 3 lions of England quartered with the fleur-de-lis of Francais, a visual assertion of his claim to both thrones. "Men of England," Henry called out, his voice carrying across the field, "be not afraid of their numbers. If God be for us, what matter is it if all France be against us? We fight not just for England this day, but for right and justice. Each man who stands with me now will forever be my brother." Thomas felt a swell of pride despite his fear. The king's words reminded him of why he had joined this campaign, not just for the promised pay, but to be part of something greater than himself. "Archers ready," came the command from Sir Thomas Erpingham, the grey-haired knight in charge of the archers. Thomas knocked an arrow to his bowstring, the familiar motion calming his racing heart. Beside him, Will did the same, his face set with determination. "Remember Crécy and Poitiers," Will muttered. "Longbows against knights. We've beaten these French lords before." The French cavalry began to advance, their horses struggling in the mud. The armoured knights, resplendent in their colourful surcoats and gleaming armour, were a fearsome sight. Yet Thomas knew their weight would be their downfall in this sodden field. "Draw!" bellowed Sir Thomas. 5,000 English longbowmen pulled their bowstrings to their ears, muscles straining with the 100-pound draw weight. "Loose!" The sky darkened with arrows. Thomas immediately reached for another shaft from his quiver, knocked, drew, and loosed again without conscious thought. Years of practice since childhood, the law requiring all Englishmen to train with the longbow, had made the motions instinctual. The first volley fell among the French cavalry. Horses reared, and knights stumbled. The French advance faltered but continued. Thomas loosed arrow after arrow, each finding its mark among the advancing forces. "They're coming through!" Will shouted, as the first wave of French men-at-arms pushed forward, despite the withering arrow fire. The churned mud slowed the heavily armoured French knights. Many slipped and fell, their armour becoming a hindrance in the mire. The English archers, having exhausted their arrows, grabbed mallets, swords, and axes, rushing forward to engage the struggling French knights. Thomas pulled his short sword and followed Will into the fray. The battle became a confused press of men struggling in the mud, with the lighter-equipped English having the advantage of mobility in the treacherous field. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. Thomas lost sight of Will in the confusion but continued fighting. The English, despite being outnumbered, maintained their discipline and formation, while the French knights struggled in the mud. A momentary break in the fighting allowed Thomas to catch his breath. He looked up to see King Henry still in the thick of battle, fighting alongside common soldiers as if he were one of them. The king's brother, the Duke of Gloucester, had fallen wounded, and Henry stood over him, protecting him until the Duke could be pulled to safety. The battle turned decisively when the French rear guard, seeing the difficulty before them, began to retreat. What had seemed an assured French victory became an unexpected defeat. As the French army withdrew in disorder, Thomas found Will resting against a tree, with a slight injury to his leg. "We've won," Will said incredulously. "By God, Thomas, we've actually won." Thomas helped secure a bandage around his friend's leg. Aye, against all odds. The field of Agincourt bore witness to an extraordinary reversal of fortune, the mighty French chivalry overcome by English archers and the treacherous mud that had trapped their heavy armor. King Henry, removing his helmet, stood among his victorious troops. His face was streaked with dirt, but his eyes shone with the light of victory. "Give the glory to God," the king commanded, ordering his chaplains to sing the Non Nobis and Te Deum. As the solemn chant rose over the battlefield, Thomas realized he had become part of a moment that would live forever in memory. In years to come, he would tell his children and grandchildren of the day when a small, exhausted English army defeated the might of France at Agincourt, led by a king who fought alongside his men and changed the course of history. The English longbowmen, common men like Thomas, had proven that the age of chivalry was giving way to a new kind of warfare, where skill and adaptability mattered more than noble birth and heavy armor. As the army prepared to continue their march to Calais, Thomas knew that nothing would ever be the same again, for him, for England, or for France.